Aiken, and this is the Successful Funding Show. For those of you new to the show, this is a weekly program on Tuesdays at 8 o'clock Mountain, 10 o'clock Eastern, where we talk about funding. Now, most of our conversation will be on small business funding or community project funding, but anything on the topic of funding, such as Bitcoin, which is what we're going to talk about today, or anything in the capital industry dealing with raising money, including charitable contributions, all fair game. Now, in this program, we have the opportunity for the community to participate in the program in the chat. They can put up a comment or they can ask a question, and we'll recognize that for those things which stay on topic. But we welcome everyone to say hello, chat with us this morning. I have as my guest Mark Maraia. Mark and I have known each other for a long time. We've worked together on some projects, including crowdfunding. And Mark is positioned himself to know as much as anybody I've talked to about Bitcoin. And he's a big advocate for Bitcoin, which I'm not. So this should be an interesting discussion. So we talked a little bit before the show started. And Mark, please share with the audience your background, how you got from where you were to today, and then we'll dive into the conversation.
That sounds good, Carl. My background really, as I said to you, and I've said to many, is that I was formerly a banking lawyer and a securities litigator for about 7 years. And then for the past 30 years, I've been training and coaching lawyers, CPAs, accountants, entrepreneurs on how to grow their business. But my history with Bitcoin, much more recent, more in 2020, when I noticed that Jay Powell kept hitting the print button on the US dollar. And I got very nervous about, if you will, the purchasing power of the dollar. So I kind of went down what we would call proverbially the Bitcoin rabbit hole. And for probably 5,000 hours, maybe, of study into Bitcoin. And I've actually written about 20 articles for Bitcoin Magazine. And really I'm sort of semi-retired. I don't really have an agenda. I don't work for a Bitcoin company. I am a member of a Bitcoin hub. There's not very many of them in the United States. That's actually in Rhino. One of these days, Carl, you'll have to come over there and visit it, called The Space. But just here for a conversation today, because I really respect and admire your knowledge around financing. And I'm a little surprised that perhaps we haven't gotten, or you haven't gotten to the point where I think you understand it pretty well, but I actually think it's a really powerful tool for small and medium-sized businesses, as well as larger companies now, who are having some difficulty with their money, which I think is almost everybody in every country. So I'll stop there and we'll move forward.
We've got a number of different subtopics. I hope we see how far we get in the hour that we have. It should be a lot of fun. Yeah. But to kick off the morning, here is Bill Houston, who is one of my partners in RCI Community Funds. Bill is the new executive director of the associated nonprofit called the RCI Academy, where we'll be teaching educational programs on community revitalization for distressed and underserved communities. So we'll be making an announcement shortly on the first course on the topic of community capital that Bill will be teaching. So everybody stand ready, because we may make the announcement as early as this afternoon. This is what we like about unscripted plays, is things happen as they happen. Don Cohen has shown up also. Don is my mentor on teaching me everything about LinkedIn, and particularly LinkedIn Live. Don puts on a show 3 times a week, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday at 9 o'clock. He'll have a show immediately after this one with Beverly Glazier, who helps women over the age of 50 put their life together and figure out what they're going to do next as they move through the back half of their life. And she's just a great person, a great consultant, advisor in this regard. So we have people in the audience who are interested in Bitcoin. I think we've set the table as well as we can. So, Mark, I think it would be good just to explain what the history of Bitcoin is, kind of how it came into existence, and then we'll move into its current use and where it might work best in the good, the bad, and the ugly.
Well, I tell you what, just giving the history of Bitcoin literally would be, multiple shows. So rather than start there, what I will do, because I'm assuming there'll be a few people who will be listening in who really go, well, what is Bitcoin? Which is also, by the way, a very difficult question to answer. And I usually, as a bit of a smartass, I come back with, well, which Bitcoin are we talking about? Because there's Bitcoin, the asset, which is very volatile, bounces up and down, extremely hard to predict where it's going next. And then there's Bitcoin, the network and the protocol, which going back through history was an amazing invention that some would say is on par with the printing press, where it's this network and protocol is not only bulletproof, bomb proof, tank proof, and nuclear resistant, it will probably be the only monetary system in the world that'll still be standing should we really have some kind of a black swan event in the world, because that also is Bitcoin. It's actually capital B. And when I say that to people, I'm really what I'm hoping is that they'll get curious. From our conversation today, I hope that people will at least have some curiosity, because to explain it to Bitcoin to a 5-year-old, it would be okay. It's a form of money where I can send it as easily as I can send email from one person to another without having a middleman like a government or a bank in between.
Well,
That's
and
I explain it like I'm 5 description, but even that's a rabbit hole we can go down for the next hour.
right, but this is actually one of the points where I think Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies may fill a great need, which is to kill credit cards off as they exist currently. I'm an anti-credit card person because one, the interest rates are phenomenally high relative to the value of the money, and two, there's a payment processing fee charged to the vendor, which is hidden to the consumer. It's just built into the purchase price of all the goods and services. And the combination is that it's an outrageous price of money for a service of minimal value, which could be better served by Bitcoin or cryptocurrencies. And I'm looking for the day that we rip down the wall of credit cards and replace it with something better. So I think that the point that you made, second one, is that the value of ability to move money, a symbolic value from one point to the other without interference, without graft, without corruption, without needless and pointless and unsupported fees
Middlemen.
by too many middle people. That creates an interesting freedom of ability to do business, ability to engage in social commerce, do other things. And it's something I fight every day. We're out trying to raise money for a charitable project, and we have credit card processing fees, which are ripping 3, 4, 5% out of the middle of a charitable donation. That's stupid, and that's the nicest way I can phrase it. But Mark, please go on. Talk some more about Bitcoin.
And actually, you're making a good point. And just back to the history. So when Bitcoin was, I would say, discovered, it was there was a white paper written in 2008. It was actually began running as actual software in January of 2009. And when it began, it had no value. Very few people were using it. It has grown in layers. So there's now something called the base layer. For most people, this won't matter. But the point you're making, there are layers built on top of it. One of them is called Lightning, that actually is more of a payment layer. It would be more accurate to say that Bitcoin's base layer is more a store of value layer. I'm oversimplifying here, just to make the point both to you and to your audience. And then there's the payment layer built on top of it, which is almost free. And you can move value from one individual to another on something as simple as a phone, right? Without any difficulty whatsoever. It's actually easier. I was almost going to offer to do this. If you want, I will send you some Bitcoin during the broadcast, because it's so easy to use that it's mind-blowing, because to understand it intellectually is no easier than actually if I said to most people, explain the US banking system, they'd have no clue how it works. Absolutely no clue. And it's
Well, they don't. No, no, you're absolutely right on that. This is a sore point for a small business, also for communities. So I have a number of gripes about the current banking system at a community level, where we're working with a distressed community, and this is where Bill and I and some other guys are working together. Every time a merchant takes a credit card payment, part of that money leaves the community and never comes back. This is what we call extraction of wealth from a community. And in an underserved community, the reason why they're underserved is that over a period of time, more wealth has fled the community than has come into the community. So they have an ever decreasing amount. And credit cards contribute to that, and they contribute a significant amount to that over time.
Yep.
It, like a number of government programs on low income housing tax credits and other things, are on my short list to go around, come up with an alternative so that the communities can start rebuilding wealth again. And the merchants who are in those communities will rise with that tide within that particular community. Anyway, Bill has stepped in with another comment here. I'll just throw it on the screen. Mark, because Bitcoin is finite, what do you think the benefits of using Bitcoin as a standard store of value for the dollar if the dollar continues to act as the global currency? Now we're getting into some good questions.
Well, in my opinion, the dollar's not doing a very good job of acting as a global currency that actually holds its value. Frankly, that's the problem. And Bitcoin does an amazing job of that. Over the last 4 years, so let's not go back all the way, it's been on average, I think it's returned 55 or 60% CAGR, which is, compound annual growth rate. It is being discovered by the institutions this year in a way that's never existed before. So I'm sure, Carl, you've heard of the fact that there are now Bitcoin ETFs. Have you heard of those? So those came on board, and that's BlackRock and a lot of very large Wall Street, trillions of dollars in capital. They're all in there. The question went away. I want to make sure I'm addressing the question. I think what is happening is it is becoming the world's most pristine store of value that we've ever had. And I don't think it's going to slow down. I'm sure some of your listeners are aware that there's discussion. There was a proposal put out by Senator Cynthia Lummis, who's a senator from Wyoming, to make Bitcoin a strategic Bitcoin reserve, much like we have a strategic gold reserve and much like we have a strategic petroleum reserve. So the movement in that direction is absolutely headed that way. And we've got two things going on, right, Carl? We got the dollar, which is going south in terms of its purchasing power. And we got Bitcoin, which is just not evenly, but it's still, it's volatile to the upside. So that volatility actually gives it vitality. And more people are discovering that. Right now, maybe 1% of the population understands, even at a crude level, what Bitcoin represents. When they understand how unreliable the US dollar is, you'll see more and more movement, as well as tools built that allow people to move into something like Bitcoin. But back to your point about community, I want to make this point really up front, because I think you'll resonate with this. Remember I talked about Bitcoin's built in layers. Well, there's a layer called Fedi or Fediment, where I'm going to be part of an experiment with this layer that's built on top of Bitcoin that's going to allow me as a Bitcoiner to provide capital to a farmer in Togo who can't handle the volatility in order to be part of something called a stability pool, so that I'm going to hold Bitcoin for the long term. So if the day after this farmer in Togo borrows money, he doesn't have to worry about the volatility of Bitcoin at all because I'm doing that. And he's going to go out and plant his crops. And at the end of the season, he's going to pay us back all in his local currency. So there's a lot of builders trying to solve some of the nastier problems that you raised at the outset of the show on the whole point about volatility. And I'm actually involved in one of those experiments right now. There's actually something that they're creating called stability pools that will allow the people who understand Bitcoin well want to hold it for short term would be 4 years, medium term would be 10 years, and ideally you'd never sell it because it's the kind of asset you can actually borrow against it. So if you're a small business owner and you have some Bitcoin on your balance sheet, you don't actually have to sell it. You can borrow dollars, US dollars against it and never have to sell it. So that's a mouthful.
Yeah, no, at one time in the history of the United States, every community had their own bank, and a lot of these banks printed their own currencies. The currency represented the fair credit and faith of the people of the community in that bank. And at one time, the United States took a similar approach with the US dollar, but that has long since been abandoned to politics. And for a senator of Montana to say that she wants to create something, I automatically cringe, because once it's politicized, it is actually, in my mind, reducing the value, the potential of using a currency of this nature. Worldwide, we have inflation everywhere. Inflation is simply the fact that over time, historically, common fiat currencies lose value annually. And I can attribute some of this loss of value to the inefficiency of the government that stands behind that particular currency. And so if we had a currency that was not restricted in this fashion, was not tied to a political group who has an agenda that they're trying to advance, which includes engaging in warfare with currency around the world, then it goes a different direction. There was a science fiction book that I think I may have referred you to, Mark, a number of years ago, called The Unincorporated Man. You can buy this on Amazon. And the storyline is a guy is put in cryo storage because he has some health issue. And he wakes up a long time later in a new world with new currencies, where the currencies of the day were run by FedEx and other companies and corporations, not by government agencies. And they were considered stable currencies because they were not run by governments with all the garbage and stuff that goes along with that. So I think that I see your point clearly made, that moving to a more stable form of currency, something that is value is, I will call it, unrestricted in some fashion, but also not motivated or politicized, has a lot of value. Part of the problem I have with Bitcoin is the price keeps going up without, in my mind, an underlying value, which means that it could crash or it could fall backwards. Now, you've made the point that it's gone up more than it's gone down, but historically, every 4 years, it goes backwards. It goes upside down. 2014, 2018, 2022. It went backwards. And granted that if somebody's going to hold this for the long term, there is no what we call rush on the bank, then it will remain more stable. If everybody loses confidence in it, though, it could be a major issue. And at some point in time, I also have concerns that if Bitcoin becomes a large dominant portion of the capital industry, its volatility could wreak havoc in the short term, and I'm just curious in that regard. So we have another comment here, which says disagree. Bitcoin is not political. I agree. Bitcoin is not political. That's its advantage. I was talking about U.S. currency, just to be absolutely clear, or Chinese currency, or any other major fiat currency of a country. The point is, says you can't even stop governments from using it. Well, that's a point of potential concern. A lot of governments have talked about interfering with these type of currencies. I don't think they're going to get there. I think this is kind of the horse that's out of the barn kind of a thing. But they are already regulating this. So keep in mind that even though they may not say no Bitcoin or no cryptocurrency, if they make you do declarations every time you move a coin from point to point, they can regulate it to death. And
Well,
this
yeah,
is one of my concerns.
just so we're clear, and again, I know Scott, so thanks for joining the conversation, Scott. He's a friend of mine. He actually has invented a really cool game, Carl, and I want to play it with you. It's called Huddle Up, and it literally is a game where you learn how Bitcoin mining works at a level that's kind of practical. But the point he's making, and so the U.S. government, for example, cannot stop Bitcoin ever. All right. And I agree with you, by the way. It's Cynthia Lummis, who's a senator in Wyoming. Whether or not it becomes kind of a political football, we can't control that. But no government can control Bitcoin. They can control the on ramps to the dollar and the off ramps to the dollar. And I think you probably would agree with me because, again, you're very sophisticated around financial stuff. The big problem is KYC and AML, which were incorporated. Remember, I'm a banking lawyer. One of them was back in the 70s. I don't remember the timing on the other one. And what they're doing is the reason governments hate Bitcoin is the reason all small business users love it, because they can't control it directly. They can only control the on-ramps and the off-ramps. They cannot control Bitcoin.
Well, let's add one more layer to that. They don't have to control it to regulate it to death. So for those of you
who can't regulate it to death, all you can do is you can deny Americans.
You can practically regulate anything to death if you make enough red tape. So for those small businesses, any businesses in the United States, there's a new Corporate Transparency Act. If you're not familiar with it, you better get in gear because they put some hefty penalties into it. But any business that was created this year in 2024 has 90 days from the date of formation in which to file documents on every owner of that particular company. And if you were existing prior to this year, you'll have a period of time after January 1st to file. But this is a way in which the government is attempting to regulate things which will ultimately impact Bitcoin and every other cryptocurrency, because they can make you submit paperwork and more paperwork until where a small business is going, I can't afford to keep all the paperwork to keep the government happy to move forward, so I'm going to quit using something. So, Mark, you're correct. They cannot directly control it, but they can certainly screw it up.
They control the on-ramps and the off-ramps. Absolutely. I'm not disputing that.
Well, this is not an on-ramp, off-ramp. This is just simply layering a cost of using something. It's a tax on top of it.
No, they can't. It could be illegal. It could be illegal tomorrow, and I can do a demonstration where I can send you Bitcoin. You will not have to give your name. You will not have to give your email. You will not have to give your phone number. You will not have to give your address. You will not have to give your social security number. And I will send you value phone to phone without it. It could be illegal, and it already is happening right now. So there are countries that have tried to make it illegal. And all that does is it makes it more, you've probably heard the term anti-fragile. It makes it more resilient, because what happens is it's an unstoppable form of sending money or value person to person. It's a little bit like saying, hey, we can make Catholicism or Christianity illegal, but it's not going to stop people from believing in it. And I think there's enough psychopaths, frankly, in Bitcoin. We're already there. I'm not saying that, that anyone listening to this has to be like that. But what it is probably the most democratic form of money that's ever been invented. And I'll repeat it for emphasis. And it's the reason governments hate it so much, because it's threatening their monopoly on money, which They don't like any, here in the United States, we can use any money we want to pay our taxes as long as it's the US dollar, right? That's not capitalism. That's not free choice. That's actually a plank in communism. It's actually a plank in Karl Marx's 10 principles of communism, which is the central bank, which I know you are not a fan of any more than I am. So.
No, I'm not. So the point I'm trying to make is, if you send me money and it has to be essentially disguised, then the government at that.
It's not disguised. That's my point. So in other words, literally, I could do a demo right now on this show.
No, but you're missing my point. If the government tells me I have to report the receipt of that money and I fail to report the receipt of the money, I've engaged in an illegal act, not because it's in Bitcoin, but because I received money without reporting it. It doesn't matter what kind of currency it's in or what format. It's no different than if you unloaded 10 bars of gold, 10 gold bars at my house, which you're free to do if anybody wants to do that. I'll just throw that out to the audience. But if you receive money and don't report it, then you're into the Al Capone scenario. They never got Al Capone for murder. They never got him for racketeering. They got him for non-payment of taxes. And this is the issue that I want to be careful about, because the government is going to mandate you report certain information, and anything that represents income is there. And I've had a number of people come to me and go, hey, look, my Bitcoin was here and then it went to here. And when I sell it, what do I have? And I go, I'm not a tax attorney, but I'm telling you, you probably have recognizable income and you're going to have to report that to the IRS. I can't do anything about that. But the better route, which Mark has referred to earlier, is don't sell the Bitcoin, keep the Bitcoin, loan money against the Bitcoin, and you could actually get two potential forms of revenue going at the same time. You've got the money you make with the money you borrowed, if it's spent on an investment, or you've got the potential uprise in value of Bitcoin over time. And again, to Mark's point, it has been volatile, but if you hold it long enough, then it appears that it will stabilize and then regain its agenda to keep moving forward. So a key thing, like any investment, if you get trapped into having to liquidate an investment at the wrong time, at the bottom of the market, in the middle of a recession, or just because things are going wrong, you probably are going to get the lowest value possible, lowest price possible. And that means you're not in control of your money. That means you're being dictated to by the markets. So an ability to make any investment is dependent upon your ability to hold it until it can peak, or until you decide when's the best time to get out of that investment.
Actually, I want to make this point because I think we sort of hinted at it right before we started to record. It is not an unreasonable point of view to look at Bitcoin as an investment. You've used that phrase a lot. In my mind, and this is now after thousands of hours of research, it is not, I repeat, it is not an investment. It's a savings tool. In fact, there are some who call it a millennial savings account. It's sort of like what you and I might have looked at for real estate back in the 70s, when we would maybe buy a piece of real estate, be able to borrow against it, and then it went up, and so we could borrow more, and then it went up again, and so we could borrow some more. The only difference is you can buy $10 worth of Bitcoin rather than have to buy an entire house worth. You don't have to buy an entire Bitcoin. And
Mark, let's underscore that point, because this is a very big deal. I'm a big advocate for crowdfunding, because when the Jobs Act was passed in 2012 and the SEC finally, after dragging their feet for 4 years, passed the regulations to enable it in 2016, it opened up the entire capital market to everybody who's a non-accredited investor, which statistically is 97% of the population, right, unless you believe the SEC's most recent bogus, I'll call it presidential administration politicking, which said it's 18% because they're counting households. And they're using math that I don't think can be substantiated. But we'll come back to
government math. Yeah.
Yeah, it's government. Well, it's government political math. So it's like the labor stuff, Look, we have no trouble with labor. Well, maybe we do have a trouble with labor. Look, we have no problem with crime. Well, maybe we do have a problem with crime. The government has reached probably its lowest credibility rating in forever. And money is one of the issues where they've been doing that. And to Mark's point, when you print money endlessly with no restriction, without any consequence as to the amount of debt that's entered into by the United States by lending it to other people, you are engaging in intentional actions that will reduce the value of the dollar as a currency. And our government, both parties, seem to be bent on doing this. This seems to be a perfect
It's a
bipartisan
bipartisan effort, no question.
One of the few places where both parties agree that we should print all the money that we can because we're who we are. It's a little bit of egotistic narcissism at the country level. Back to Bill's earlier question about a global currency, the dollar has been viewed as the most stable, even if it's going down in value. It still appears to be more stable than any of the other national currencies. So then when Bitcoin comes along and it's not going down in value, but it's going up in value, this has got to be a cause of great concern to any government around the world who is using their currency for all kinds of purposes, political agendas as well, not necessarily for the benefit of the people, but for the benefit of the people in power. There are all kinds of reasons to look into going to a better mechanism for moving money back and forth, independent of Bitcoin, as we've discussed it, as either a savings account or an investment or whatever you want to call it.
Well, and Carl, I agree with everything you've said. That I think the brilliance and the beauty of Bitcoin is it really is a money that is so decentralized that no individual government or even large corporation or billionaire can control it. They can buy it and try to affect the price. They can't control the. Remember, I go back to which Bitcoin are we talking about? I'm not talking about the asset now, which is volatile. I'm talking about the network and the protocol, which I would otherwise call the time chain, just as a shorthand way of referring to both the network and the protocol. It's the first instance on the internet where I can send value to you natively without a middleman. And so that piece of it, and the reason it makes it a savings tool to me and not an investment, is that I know that it's not going to change because it's something called digital scarcity, which again, people don't have to get too caught up in what that means, other than there's just a finite supply that's reinforced through consensus rules, through cryptography, and it's very difficult to understand at sort of the granular level. But what has been happening for 16 years is that's been steadily going up further and further. For a small business person or even a medium-sized business person to put it in their treasury, there are more companies that literally just this year are starting to learn how to put it on their balance sheet and use it as an advantage, as an asset they can use in their treasury on their balance sheet, because it's not a melting ice cube like the dollar, which, as you point out, is easily the best of the bunch, but it's still a government controlled currency that literally Jay Powell, when he printed $7 trillion back in 2020, he immediately destroyed the purchasing power of everybody that was using that currency by 20% overnight without any permission. We didn't give him permission to do that. He just did it. He took the power, as you said earlier. It's the political power that he took to do it. You can't do that with Bitcoin. So there's all this building going on top of the base layer of Bitcoin, which again is the network. There's payment layers being built on top of it. And you get more privacy as you go up those layers. And it will probably end up at the point where you and I can actually interact with Bitcoin. And even though there's all the laws that you're talking about that are out there, they'll literally have figured out a way to skirt between those laws because of the nature of the way they're building around it, so that you're actually going to have complete privacy and you won't be running afoul of any law. And even if somehow you did, they'd have no way of knowing it or discovering it, which again is why it terrifies government so much.
Well, and just over the last few years, there's been half a dozen to a dozen laws, international laws, treaties, the likes, all on money transfer. And anyone who is operating a platform or exchange may find themselves now dealing with currencies,
Right.
which is a separate licensing body of regulation different from the sale of securities. And this has been one of the problems we've had, is that the government, as much as it wants to control and know everything, it has fumbled the ball terribly with regard to cryptocurrencies, which is part of the reason why you have FTX and all the other debacles which have occurred. Because you're like, well, yeah, I want to set up a Ponzi scheme. Well, I'm going to use cryptocurrency to make it happen because I can do more quicker and I can get more people on board, or I can hack somebody's cryptocurrency account and steal everything out of their account. It's beyond the wild west. There are no rules in this zone, and the government, the U.S. government, has been slow. I had Tom Fry on my program last week, who is an advocate for Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies. He stated that he thought the country of Japan had done a better job, and I can't even begin to explain what he said. I'm just adding this as a
I would agree with him. Yeah, but the handle Mt. Gox was actually pretty decent. Yeah, because the first big exchanges that blew up was in Japan.
Yeah, so there are ways for governments to work with these new ways of exchanging payments, exchanging value that do not necessarily have to be under the iron control of an agency like the SEC, which seems to only care about brokers and the big banks and our Federal Reserve System, which in my mind continues to engage in a fashion that is detrimental to the people of the United States. And it's as Mark has said, it's probably a good whole program. If we just talked about the Central Reserve Banking System, that would be a program all by itself. And I probably need to bring in a couple more people to get on the panel because I have no ability to explain it. I couldn't even probably moderate the program well. But the thing is we have all kinds of systems out there in the capital industry. I often joke about it is so screwed up that it wasn't, you couldn't even begin to creatively design it to be as screwed up as it is. It has to devolve from a flawed system into something that's even more flawed over time. And as a consequence, not everybody has the ability to participate. The participation is clearly biased in favor of the wealthy, the more powerful. This creates even more disruption or inequity within the market. And it's one of the things we battle when we work with local communities where we're trying to help them stand on their own 2 feet, be all they can be when we're fighting against a system that says we don't care and you're the victims.
Well, and just on that note, so one of the things I love the most about Bitcoin and the rails themselves, the time chain, as I said, is it always treats everyone who joins its network the same. There's absolutely no favor given to anybody, and it operates with a fair and predictable set of rules that humans can't readily change without mass support from people who run something called nodes. And again, it's detail people don't need to mess with. And unlike the 160 currencies that operate in countries around the world that are monopolies, right, with varying levels of ability to extract wealth from their citizens, right, by the minute sometimes, you know, that these are what governments are doing right now is they're trying to gain greater and greater and greater control of the money, so that we end up with an Orwellian surveillance system that frankly is very troubling, as you pointed out earlier. And obviously that comes with huge downside risk. Well, guess what? Bitcoin isn't just a hedge against that. Bitcoin is a solution for that. That literally, and it is the only one that I know of. And I'm not a big fan of all the other cryptocurrencies out there. If I were, listening to this for the first time, the only one that I'd feel safe starting with would be Bitcoin. And then I would say study it before you buy a lot of it, because it's really, really easy. I would say most people have varying levels of financial illiteracy. We're not taught that in school, right?
No,
You're an
no, no.
unusual character in that way, right?
I have the stats on that.
I know you
Actually,
do.
this came up a few weeks ago. According to the most recent study, half of the people in the United States will not pass a basic financial literacy test. And actually, Gen Z, only 37% passed it this last year. And part of the reason is that for whatever reason, our educational system, which may be missing a department here in the near future, has not determined that financial literacy is a needed skill by every person, going forward. There are only 7 states in the United States who offer a full semester of teaching financial literacy at the high school level. And there are apparently about 20 states that are trying to correct that and are working to have some stuff in place over the next couple of years. But it would seem like if anything, you're going to teach at the high school level, and I actually would push it down into the elementary school. I would start teaching financial literacy. And when we talk literacy, again, I want to be careful here because they're teaching basic stuff like balancing your checkbook and a basic 401k investment in a mutual fund, which I also disagree with, but that's another story. When we talk about financial literacy, I'm talking about a much higher level, and one of those is at the community level. We talked earlier about moving money in and out of a community will contribute to its wealth of the individuals in the community or not. It's either extractive or it's building. And this basic concept of community capital is one that's missing from all financial literacy courses because they talk about it as though you, an individual, are like an island that's self-sufficient and so forth. And you're not. You're part of a social network. You're part of a global network, whether you want to believe that or not. Just go down to Walmart and count the number of products that came in from outside the country, and that will give you an idea of how international you truly are. Same thing with currencies. We have an old system in place where every country gets to set its own currency, and they have reasons to want to retain control of that. Some of which make sense and some of which are not helping to you as an individual. And if we were to move to a global currency, a single thing, whether it's Bitcoin or something else, that's not influenced by the local politics that are out there. One of the questions I have, Mark, this is as I've studied Bitcoin a little and looked at it, it's been going up in value, in my mind, at a rate and pace that is unsustainable. So I'm anticipating that somewhere in the future, based upon the way Bitcoin is structured, that it'll plateau to some degree, meaning that the rate of growth will decline and it'll start flattening out as a more of a mature type of thing. It will still increase because it's tied relative to currency. So every time a dollar decreases in value because of inflation, Bitcoin should have a corresponding increase in value because it did not decrease in value. Would you say that's a fair projection that somewhere down the road we'll see these large increases in price slow down?
Yeah, I think so. But the question is when, and that's anyone tells you they can predict that is delusional because you can't. There's a very well-known CEO of a company called MicroStrategy. You would find this very interesting, Carl, because he's kind of rewriting the playbook right now. He's issuing convertible bonds on Wall Street, and they're selling out in like a day. in billions at a time. And he's basically saying, look, I'm going to sell you these bonds. I'm going to turn around. I'm going to buy Bitcoin. And he does. And then he shows, and it's the best performing bond on Wall Street. And as you know, and it's an outlier. It's not even close. Like number 2 is not even in his ballpark. So that's all starting to get the institutions to pay attention. So now they're looking at it. And again, they're seeing it as an investment, right? I'm not saying that the world.
Yeah, but it's easy to understand. The year to date, Bitcoin's going up 109%, according to something I saw yesterday. And the average business in the United States is making 7 to 10% profit a year. This is one of the challenges I have, is I'm trying to work with small businesses in raising funding. And when they put their business up as an investment opportunity that can only generate 10% profit, and if they gave up half the ownership of the company or half of the profits to an investor, it's only going to pay a 5% annualized rate. And then you compare it to Bitcoin, and you're going, well, you'd have to do 20 to 30 times better to compete with Bitcoin. So it makes all kinds of sense if you play in that game to go, well, let's take currency, buy Bitcoin, and automatically know that we're going to come out ahead. If you just use the stats going back over time, it would make sense to move all of your dollars into Bitcoin if you're holding it and can hold it through all the volatility that will be there.
That transpires. Actually, let me jump in though with an example, because I think you'll get a kick out of this. This is literally, this just happened this week, earlier this week. Must have been yesterday. Or maybe it was Friday. There's a gentleman who runs Newmark Capital. They just financed, so they're basically an RIA. They, on behalf of one of their clients, which is a pension fund, they financed a building in Philadelphia that's not far from where the Liberty Bell is. And I think it was 63 units. And they paid off the old mortgage with the proceeds. They used some of the proceeds to fix up the building, so to bring it up to speed, and they bought $2 million, i.e. 20 Bitcoin, as additional collateral, so that the pension fund now has something that actually both reduces their risk, increases their potential return, and actually starts to solve the pension problems, the pension fund problems in the United States and all over the world. So that what they're doing is they're bundling deals with Bitcoin involved in the deal, not as the only part of the deal, but literally to make the deal work, because in some cases that pension fund might not have done that deal at all without the Bitcoin. So it's literally allowing deals to happen now that wouldn't have happened at all if they hadn't had Bitcoin as part of that package. And I can send you that offline. We don't have to do it now.
Well, we're going to have to come back and talk about this in some different layers, because we're going to go off in different directions. Because the volume of money going into Bitcoin, if you just pulled it out of the marketplace, by definition, that money's not working. Okay, when we talk about an investment, if I put money into land and I just sit there, it's called land banking. The money's not doing anything.
They'd rather do that than leave it in the dollar, right? Figuring it'll hold better.
This gets into a whole bunch of issues about what we call working money that generates economic activity, economic growth, relative to doing stuff that is, in my mind, pointless. And we've got a whole bunch of examples. Bill asked another question of you, Mark. He says, how do you see Bitcoin impacting the investment crowdfunding industry? And I am as interested in Bill in hearing your answer.
This question, yeah. So actually, you may not be aware of this. There is a specific Bitcoin-specific crowdfunding platform called Geyser, Geyser.
Okay.
So it's already been going now for at least 2 years. And it would be just simply another platform like a GoFundMe or something else that actually exists already, that's out there. As I also mentioned to you, there are actually Bitcoin-only venture capital firms. And what they're doing is they're saying, okay, does this at least give me the return on capital I'm going to get if I just sit there and live with Bitcoin on my balance sheet? So it's raising the bar in terms of what they're expecting for returns, but in a healthy way. There if here's the what's the right word? The cheat code for the business owner, and I can give you specific examples. There's a restaurant called Tahini's back in 2020, very small at the time, chain of Middle Eastern restaurants up in Ontario, Canada, that actually said, we're going to start putting Bitcoin on our balance sheet because they were worried about the Canadian dollar. They
Right.
have gotten more free publicity. And the fact that I'm talking to you about it now is unbelievable. It is nowhere near the size of a business that would get the kind of global scale recognition that it's gotten had it not put Bitcoin in its balance sheet. There are advantages, not yet enough. So there's the store of value of Bitcoin is one milestone that I think it's reached. That's why Wall Street's in love with it. There's then the medium of exchange use of money that has always existed around Bitcoin, but is going to come around eventually, already is for 7.5 billion people on the planet that don't have a currency that they can rely on. It is already a lifesaver for places all around the globe. To us privileged here in the United States who don't have to worry about that, it's not there yet. But for the rest of the world, it is. And there any small or medium-sized business that wants to actually crowdfund exclusively in Bitcoin, I'm more than happy to have a conversation with them because it presents advantages that the average small and medium-sized business who's only dealing in, let's say, US dollars, they just don't have those advantages. They will, and so that's the undiscovered part of it, if you will, Carl.
Yeah, well, that presents some interesting combinations. We are working through RCI community funds to raise dollars to advance communities that have been left behind. So, yes, it's true that Bitcoin is accessible to everybody around the world, but there are a lot of communities across the United States that have been left behind that might also benefit from this.
Yeah.
And the deal structure that is suggested would be to raise dollars, one way of doing it, which would be used to acquire Bitcoin, and then borrow money against the Bitcoin to actually do the building retrofits, to invest in the local businesses. You would have the rate of return that you would have to pay to investors on the initial platform, plus the cost of interest on the money borrowed with Bitcoin as a collateral for that loan. But that cost might be offset. It would have been over the last 12 months if we had raised a $1 million fund at the beginning of this year and borrowed against it, even with high interest rates. All that interest would have been repaid, and we still would have a higher book value today than we would have had before we started, and have acquired all these assets and spent all this money to improve it and appreciate those assets.
Yeah.
So,
and that's, on that note, you and I think, met each other in part through our involvement in Slow Money, which is all about soil and soil restoration. And I'm actually still kicking around the idea of fundraising some amount of capital that would go into a soil restoration bond fund that is going to go up programmatically over the next 10 years. So whoever's going to donate to that just sits in there, and it's going to grow, and it's going to become and allow people to, farmers, let's say, to use it as a funding source. Because one of the challenges for farms is they don't have the money to actually either lease or own the land. I think that the Bitcoiners are long-term thinkers. They look out 100 years. You don't do that with dollars. And I think it will actually, the idea I have for soil is to create a soil restoration bond where the people who put the money in aren't looking for any quick returns, and we can turn around and borrow against it, give it to farmers who can use it to do any number of things to build and restore soil. just as an example, another example building on what.
Yeah, that clearly is a topic for another day, because I think there's a lot of secondary issues with your
Oh, there's
proposal.
tons.
Yeah, but for today, I think that it's interesting for the audience to see Bitcoin as an alternative to a fiat or country currency. There are a number of benefits that can come from that. With the recognition of the volatility that exists in the price point, there still may be a variety of strategies that a small business or a community may want to consider. And if nothing else, anyone who's raising funding, and this was part of my article yesterday, I put out an instant funding newsletter on a daily basis. And basically, I'm saying if you're raising funding today, you're competing against Bitcoin. And you cannot say you're not. You can't say that.
You don't have to. The point I tried to make earlier is you don't have to compete against Bitcoin. You have to understand how to use Bitcoin to actually enhance your ability to actually raise funds to achieve your project goals.
Which is a perfect topic for another day.
For another day. Yeah. Well, and back to your communities. If let's say you've got a community, and this is actually happening back in the East Coast, you got all these old mills that ran water. There's a way to actually take running water and turn it into the world's hardest money, which is Bitcoin, if you know what you're doing by attaching Bitcoin miners to it. So you're literally taking a natural resource, it's running water, and you haven't figured out a way to monetize it. If you have running water and you're in Costa Rica or Nicaragua or El Salvador, you can actually turn it into Bitcoin if you know how to do so. So there are actually opportunities at the community level. You and I can talk about those offline, or we can do it again in another show. This has been fun.
Yeah. So what I'm going to do, Mark, is I'm going to publicize your.
Yeah, someone's asking for my social media link. I typically, you can certainly find me on Twitter. I get hold of Carl if they have your contact information. If anyone has any questions or they want to talk about a specific application, to your point, Carl, about communities, I am more than happy to devote whatever time is necessary for free to help communities start to use it, because I completely agree with your premise that there's a lot of rural communities in particular who've been left hung out to dry, in part because of the way the system works. And Bitcoin's actually an amazing tool for them regaining some control over that isn't obvious on its face.
Well, it isn't, because they have to do something different. All these rural communities came into existence because there was land and forest and mining that they could take value from. And that was an established industry. And those have either disappeared or dissipated to the point they need a brand new industry. So if the rural community doesn't stand up a new industry, all the money in the world is not going to help them.
Not going to solve the problem.
It's not going to, because they still have the problem. They just, Bitcoin might serve as a mechanism or a tool to solve that problem, but they've got to get down to a basic industry level, which is generating value greater than the amount that's already there. So that is a great topic. I put up Mark's contact information, so all the million of viewers can send him an email later today. But Mark, definitely will have you come back on, and we're going to be talking about how Bitcoin can be built into a fundraising campaign in order to optimize both the probability of funding and reduce the cost of money, and so on. So there's a number of great topics going forward. I appreciate your being on the show today. Do you have any last things, closing comments that you'd like to share with our audience?
My parting thought would be this: Bitcoin is a tool. And by the way, this is a quote from Jack Dorsey, former CEO of Twitter, now CEO of Block. Bitcoin is a tool for human empowerment that's on par with the printing press when you finally do enough homework around it. So I appreciate your taking the time today, Carl, to have the conversation. And I look forward to more dialogue.
Sounds great. Thank you, Mark. Thank you to our audience. Mark, hang on for a minute, and we'll see you next week. on the Successful Funding Show, 8 o'clock Mountain, 10 o'clock Eastern.